What is the most unsettling, declassified information available to the public? Story 1. January 3rd, 1961, a United States B-52 bomber went into a tailspin and broke up midair, accidentally dropping two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs over Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the bombs worked exactly as intended. Its parachute deployed and its triggers activated, armed and ready to detonate on impact. Three of the four safety switches failed. A single low-voltage switch prevented two 4-megaton nuclear explosions. Story 2. I remember reading something about a conspiracy nut who failed to receive all the info. Freedom of Information Act. The CIA had on mind control and putting thought into people's heads. A lot of people laughed at him, then promptly shat their pants when the guy received about 20-plus pages on all the experiments the CIA had done on the subject. Apparently, using microwaves, scientists were able to make subjects hear single-syllable words in their heads. What's crazy is that if they could do this, then imagine all the crap that was either shredded or is too classified to release. Story 3. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archive. The way they describe it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocity that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. During the 1950s, there were details in the uncovered document about detention camp and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known until Story 4. Personally, I think it is Echelon. In case you don't know, it was a signal intercept program that began in the 1960s. Basically, NATO, Australia, and New Zealand all agreed to spy on each other and share the information. That way, they wouldn't be violating any domestic laws about spying on citizens. This was all widely disclosed between 1988 to 2001, but people act like Snowden was the first time we found out the government was listening. No one was ostracized or called crazy for saying this. The truth is that hardly anyone cared at the time. Then 9/11 happened, and even less people cared what the government did. Echelon doesn't fit the question, though, as it is still very classified. We only know tiny bits and pieces from declassified sources. Declassifying that would be a huge legal storm. Also fascinating is the history of Promise software, which came out of the private sector and was sold to the highest bidders. It allowed Israel to spy on the US and supposedly allowed bin Laden to track what the US knew about. This was the precursor to the NSA's PRISM program, which we know some stuff about thanks to Snowden, but is also still very, very classified. Story 5. Miscellaneous Cold War stuff, where the US and Russia nearly started World War III, nearly nuked their own cities, or the fusion weapons they lost, some of which have never been recovered. The craziest thing that might have happened is definitely Project Pluto, a giant nuclear-powered cruise missile which would loiter over the oceans for years, waiting and polluting for years while waiting for World War III. When the call for Armageddon came, they would race down to fighting altitude, go supersonic, and start automatically dropping thermonuclear bombs on their target list. And once out of bombs, crash into another target, spreading fallout all over the place. $1 billion was spent developing this. Nuclear engines were made and worked. Another guy, as a concept, came up with salting nuclear weapon, where a nuclear weapon would have its tamper salted in such a way to greatly increase the fallout, such as producing cobalt-60 to deny use of the area to, well, life. Story 6 Phoenix Program. CIA and Special Ops death squads in Vietnam. They absolutely will not mention this in your high school or college classes. The problem was, how do you find the people on the blacklist? It's not like you had their address and telephone number. The normal procedure would be to go into a village and just grab someone and say, "Where's Nguyen, so-and-so?" Half the time, the people were so afraid they would not say anything. Then a Phoenix team would take the informant, put a sandbag over his head, poke out 2 holes so he could see, put common wire around his neck like a long leash, and walk him through the village and say, "When we go by Nguyen's house, scratch your head." Then that night, Phoenix would come back, knock on the door, and say, "April Fool, mother trucker." Whoever answered the door would get wasted. As far as they were concerned, whoever answered was a communist, including family members. Sometimes they'd come back to camp with ears to prove that they killed people. Story 7, Project Pluto. Basically, it was a missile powered by a nuclear reactor driving a ramjet engine. It would carry a payload of several nuclear warheads, and after it dropped all the nukes, it would then spend months flying over areas at supersonic speeds powered by the reactor. It would fly so low, in fact, that it would create shockwave that could level buildings, and the jet exhaust would be highly radioactive. It was essentially a true doomsday device, and very seriously looked into by the US. And what's terrifying is that it's declassified now, meaning even more insane stuff probably exists as black projects. Story 8. that the US government secretly performed radiation experiments on hundreds of citizens, used as human guinea pigs over 30 years, from the 40s through the 70s, with the knowledge of thousands of officials and medical personnel, and kept secret until the 90s. The story was finally broken by reporter Eileen Wellsome, who won the Pulitzer for her reporting and led to congressional hearings. I had first heard a few stories in the 90s, but did not truly know the full extent until I read her book, The Plutonium Files, Democracy Now! Also did an interview with Wellsome a few years back, which you can listen to here, where you'll find out such things as, in a Massachusetts school, 73 disabled children were spoon-fed radioactive isotopes, along with their morning oatmeal. In an upstate New York hospital, an 18-year-old woman, believing she was being treated for a pituitary disorder, was injected with plutonium by Manhattan Project doctors. At a Tennessee prenatal clinic, 829 pregnant women were served vitamin cocktails, in truth, drinks containing radioactive iron as part of their prenatal treatment. Story 9. The use of Chernobyl biorobots. In order to seal and cap the reactor within a sarcophagus, they needed to clear rubble from the nearby roof, a large portion of which was literally material from the core itself. At first, they used remote-piloted robots, but they died pretty damn fast due to the radiation being too much for their electronics. So instead, they used biorobots, or as they are more commonly known, human beings. Groups of soldiers would dress in hastily made lead suits. They had to make them themselves. And for 45-second intervals, they would shovel rubble from the roof back into the exposed core of the reactor. After only this short time, the robots would experience deep bone pain, blurred sight, and a lot of other scary, fudging symptoms that are best not thought about. They did multiple rotating groups shoveling the inside of a nuclear reactor. They were rewarded with bottles of Pepsi and Coke. Footage of it can be found here, but full details of what happened were slow to come out. But the fact people were labeled robots, just so they felt a tad easier sending people to shovel the worst substance humanity has yet wrought. Kind of chilling. Story 10. My favorite has to be the US military's first Broken Arrow event. The evening of Valentine's Day 1951, USAF Bomber 075, a B-36 Peacemaker bomber carrying a Mark IV Fat Man nuclear weapon, suddenly loses power to 3 of its 6 turboprop engines. While on a training mission following the British Columbia coastline, with no other options, the crew drops the bomb into the Pacific and sets its autopilot to fly out into the Pacific while the crew bailed out. All hands except for the plane's weaponizer, Captain Ted Schreier. Instead of flying out into the Pacific and crashing, the crippled bomber made a complete U-turn and flew inland heading north towards Alaska, eventually landing on a mountaintop in the Kispiox Ranges near Terrace, BC. When the plane was discovered in 1953, the USAF took over the airfield at Smithers, BC and helicopter into the crash site, gathering important technologies before blowing the plane to bits. It is believed by some that the Fat Man bomb on board 075 was in fact armed, and the weaponizer tried to fly the bomber home. When the bomb was discovered at the crash site, the Air Force detonated the bomb, as they had no means of safely removing it from the mountain. Story 11. Came across this today in the briefs for Glossop versus Gross, a Supreme Court case about the constitutionality of methods of lethal injection. Basically, the European manufacturers of the sedatives usually used to knock the execution out before a paralyzing agent then a poison are injected, stopped selling the drugs for use in executions. Oklahoma's prosecutors disclosed in emails that were later leaked that they would be willing to trade the secret for how to get more sedative to Texas's prosecutors if the Texans found a way to get 4 tickets at the 50-yard line for Team Pentobarbital at the annual Texas-Oklahoma football game. Shocking flippancy from people whose job is about life or death decision. Story 12. This will probably get buried, but when I was in college, I took an American foreign policy class, which covered the 20th century. The professor was amazing and really blew my mind several times. One of the things we studied that had a huge impact on my naive mind was Operation Northwood. This was a proposed CIA operation in which anti-Castro Cubans would shoot up parts of downtown Miami, conduct bombings, and other terrorist acts so that the United States could declare war on Cuba and take Fidel Castro out. Thankfully, JFK thought the operation crazy and refused to give it the green light. This was 2003 and 2004, and 9/11 was still in the forefront of everyone's mind. Needless to say, a lot of us were speechless after reading the declassified files. Story 13, Operation Choke Point. Operation Choke Point is an initiative of the United States Department of Justice that was announced in 2013, which is investigating banks in the United States and the business they do with payment processors, payday lenders, and other companies believed to be at higher risk for fraud and money laundering. In other words, the government would tell banks not to loan people money to people involved with certain industries. Now, that might not sound too bad until you read the list of things being investigated, which includes anyone selling firearms or ammunition, fireworks stores, lotteries, and tobacco stores. Of course, now they just say that banks shouldn't loan to those people instead of outright telling them not to. Story 14. Probably nuclear testing on humans by the US and the UK. The US causing fallout and white snow on villagers in the Rongelap Atoll. Burned eyes, burnt skin, miscarriages, diarrhea, vomiting, hair loss, and eventual death. Then the UK testing weapons in Australia on Australian military personnel, Aboriginals, and eventually most of its citizens in the eastern states. Tests carried out did not fully take into account local Aboriginal isolation, and the UK military did not make a hard enough effort to warn and move these people, with groups being either killed by the tests or being covered in the fallout. Tests conducted on the Australian military included soldiers removing clothing and rolling in dirt contaminated with fallout, all the way up to standing in unsafe proximity to fallout. Story 15. Wow, this is extremely relevant. Well, I'm a senior at Colorado State University, and I'm in a course on the history of modern Latin America, and our final project was the transferring of the data in the declassified Bay of Pigs document, so it is easier to comprehend. My task was to collect the data from the first part of the Taylor Committee, which reviewed the operation. I found this unsettling in that there are quite a few wrong dates. For example, the first meeting took place on the 22nd and the 23rd of April in 1961, but the second meeting took place on the 11th of March in 1961. There are quite a few witnesses with questionable dates, especially the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell D. Taylor, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and others. So from this, we can hypothesize that these documents were edited at some point in their history, or our tax dollars are hard at work. Sarcasm. To me, at least, this is incredibly unsettling. If you want to do more research here, is the link for the documents on air operations, planning, foreign policy, anti-Castro policy, and the Taylor Committee. Story 16. What Canada did to the First Nations peoples after Confederation. From the late 1800s to just before World War II, thousands of Aboriginal children were assigned European names, dressed in European-style clothing, taught English, and sent to re-education camps where they were basically taught about how the English and French saved them from their savage parents and that they were the scum of the earth and could never survive in modern society on their own. Some were lucky and integrated into society with their sanity and dignity intact, but most were sterilized and sent to reservations. This nonsense continued well into the 1970s, with the RCMP engaging in starlight tours, where First Nations men would be detained for the most petty offenses, such as a speeding ticket or jaywalking, and driven out into the wilderness in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, and left for dead. It's amazing how such a tolerant society would treat its native people so badly. Story 17. In 1954, the U.S. relocated Marshallese people from their home on Bikini Atoll and proceeded to detonate Castle Bravo, a hydrogen bomb 1,000 times the strength of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Fallout and radiation spread onto the inhabited atolls of Rongelap and Rongerik atolls, causing horrendous injuries, cancer, and terrifying birth defects. They didn't even evacuate the islands until 48 hours after detonation, and those affected received questionable medical care. Project 4.1 was the secret medical study conducted of the Marshallese people's exposure to radioactive fallout. The U.S. continues to maintain that the exposure was accidental due to the unexpected high yield and a major wind shift. Story 18. What about the CIA's MK Ultra? M stands for mind and K is control. They were testing the possibilities of using LSD in their operations. They experimented widely. They first thought it could be a truth serum, miserably failing. Then they thought they could just reprogram enemy spies with it, or just knock them out by putting LSD in their cigarettes. Seeing that it is odorless, colorless, and you need just very little of it, they experimented on civilians. The cigarettes, psychiatric tests, but the worst was the following. They secretly sustained a brothel where clients would be secretly dosed with LSD. Beyond a one-way mirror, a doctor, a famous socialite at that, looked and took note. The result of all this is just a serious failure, a bit like the first scene of Pineapple Express. All the documents are declassified, and you can read about it in the book. Acid Dreams, Story 19. Project A, 119, also known as A Study of Lunar Research, was a top-secret plan developed in 1958 by the United States Air Force. The aim of the project was to detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon, which would help in answering some of the mystery in planetary astronomy and astrogeology. And had the explosive device not entered into a lunar crater, the flash of explosive light would have been faintly visible to people on Earth with their naked eye, a show of force resulting in a possible boosting of domestic morale and the capabilities of the United States, a boost that was needed after the Soviet Union took an early lead in the space race and who were also working on a similar project. Story 20. On January 3, 1961, a United States B-52 bomber went into a tailspin and broke up midair, accidentally dropping two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs over Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the bombs worked exactly as intended. Its parachute deployed and its triggers activated, armed and ready to detonate on impact. 3 of the 4 safety switches failed. A single low-voltage switch prevented 2 4-megaton nuclear explosions. The dude from SMBC proposes, in a comic, that the world gets stranger the longer it's been since the invention of nuclear weapons because it becomes less and less likely that we'd have survived this long. Story 21. Where I live in Rochester, NY, during the Manhattan Project, doctors at the University of Rochester Medical School with Hospital injected radioactive material into patients who were there for normal medical treatment to observe the effects over time. Obviously, none of the patients were told this was being done. Some died within days, some died many years later. They gave different doses. I guess this is the most disturbing thing to me because it happened in my city. Similar things happened all over the country. Pretty gnarly stuff. Story 22. I mean, it's all around you. Look at the Panama Papers, for Christ's sake. They all are corrupt. It's part of what it is to be that high up the chain. To be that high up the chain and not be involved in corruption would be like a deer spending its entire life just prancing through the forest without a care in the world. Try that for a little while, and you'll be killed right away by another hungry animal or a hunter-easy target. But they don't do that. They craft a way around it all, sneak around, hide, duck, try to stay quiet in the forest to survive. I mean, it's in the news you hear every day. From independent news to mainstream, it's all around you all the time, every day. Another top official being caught doing something scandalous. It's a game you have to play once you reach that high on the ladder. And they go in and out of private industry all the time, back into government and so on. I mean, for Christ's sake, went to WAR with a country, and our VP had direct ties to a corporation who profited $40 billion from cleaning it up. Do you not see the relationship here? This is not the exception, some crazy story from 15 years ago. It's standard practice in Washington, business as usual. Story 23. Surgical experiments, pathogens, disease, and biological warfare agents, human radiation experiments, chemical experiments, psychological and torture experiments, deliberate infection of people with deadly or debilitating diseases, exposure of people to biological and chemical weapons, human radiation experiments, injection of people with toxic and radioactive chemicals, surgical experiments, interrogation and torture experiments, tests involving mind-altering substances, and a wide variety of others. Many of these tests were performed on children, the sick, and mentally disabled individuals, often under the guise of medical treatment. In many of the studies, a large portion of the subjects were poor, racial minorities, or prisoners. Story 24. One thing that always gives me the creeps is how the government in the 70s in the UK gave instructions on how to protect yourself should a nuclear bomb be dropped. Instructions were to make a shelter under tables surrounded by pillows and mattresses. Essentially, rather than protecting you, what would happen if you followed these is that you would be instantly incinerated because the government couldn't have coped with the cleanup. There was actually a really detailed pamphlet that covered everything from shelters you can build inside a house, removing doors to build a lean-to shelter in the structurally strongest part of the house, to digging an underground shelter in a garden. The bit you reference was the simplest kind of shelter, and the idea that it was supposed to burn you to death is bullcrap, just like when people say the brace position during an air crash is to break your neck for a quick death. The point about that nuclear survival advice was getting as many people as possible to build shelters of some kind from stuff most people would have in their houses. It was a numbers game. If you happened to be in the zone that would get enough heat that everything would burn, then there's little that can be done, even for improvised underground shelters where you'd suffocate. However, the zone that would be hit by the shockwave is larger than the zone that would burn, so it made perfect sense to get everyone to build shelters that increased the chance of surviving a house collapse. Story 25. Personally, I think the most unsettling thing was never classified to begin with. Law enforcement has been using license plate scanners attached to their vehicles for several years now. It's not echelon-type stuff. It's simply every police car tracking the movements of every vehicle it sees. There's useful information that can be gleaned. Finding people with active warrants is one of them. There's scary information that can be gleaned. Like, what has my ex-wife been? It's not a nationwide database yet. It's not every police department, but the number of PDs, sheriff's offices, etc., that are actively using this technology is astounding. And the information available to individual officers and FOIA requests is out of this world. Worried about Big Brother? Don't be. Be worried about the stalker that lives down the street. Story 26. When the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia, they first asked permission for 2 big cargo airplanes to land on the capital city, Prague. They landed, and special forces ran out of those planes and took the airport. This was before the tanks reached Prague. Then they kept the planes coming, bringing more troops to get hold of radio stations, etc. But they had asked permission for similar planes to land on Helsinki, Finland. And I'm not sure if it was to Poland and East Germany, too. The USSR was ready for escalation of that act to a full-blown war between NATO and Warsaw Pact. At the North Sea at the border of Norway and the USSR, fighters were doing fast runs towards each other. The fighters pulled up just before collision and went on full thrust up bottom on bottom. Weapon systems were hot. This story is from Norwegian. Russians also mobilized the Baltic Fleet and sailed them to the borders of Finland. They were in an attack position, and Finnish coastal artillery was on full alert. Story 27. I found out this past summer that my uncle who died in Vietnam, whom I'm named after, died a true hero. He received a Silver Star, and all we ever knew of the story was that he was wounded once and was shortly after shot in the head. As we found out, my uncle and his fellow brothers were dropped accidentally behind enemy lines. As soon as they landed, they were surrounded. The men ran to get back to our side, but they had no way of slowing down the enemy. My uncle grabbed an M60, turned it around backwards, and fired as he ran. As some gun enthusiasts know, the M60 gets very hot when fired for extended periods. My uncle, being the man that he was, never took his hands off the trigger and barrel. After one hand was extremely burnt, he switched hands. That's where his initial wounds that we already knew about came into play. Anyways, after one evac helicopter landed, and they begged my uncle to go, he refused so he could protect the rest of his men. He stayed mounted on his M60 until the second helicopter landed, and as he turned around to sit down and continue fire, he was shot in the head. I really wish I could have met the man. He really was a hero.